Hey everybody, welcome back to Dispatches. For those of you who don't know, Dispatches is an adventure motorcycle ride that is aimed at breaking down the stigma surrounding post-traumatic stress disorder within the veteran and first responder communities. My name is Mike Terry. I am a 23-year veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces. I've been affected by PTSD since about 2001, 2002, after returning from operations in Africa. And yeah, so I started Dispatches in 2018 when I retired because I started to notice the effects of that mental injury, that operational stress injury, really started to take hold when I left the forces. So I decided to start sharing my story, and in the hopes that other people would share theirs. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about something I've been noticing that's going on. And it's going to relate to coronavirus, and I'm sure we're all sick of hearing of it. But coronavirus itself is not the main topic of discussion. Today, what I wanted to talk about was functional disconnection. And functional disconnection, if you were to Google that term, you're going to come up with a lot of, in a psychological sense, I found most of it was related to ADHD or autism. But I've spoken before about emotional numbing, and particularly when under times of stress or when I've been on operations or deployed, there's this, emotional numbing that takes place where a lot of your emotions are just basically kind of, you're kind of just disconnected from them. And I was introduced to this term functional disconnection by somebody else in a conversation, in the last few months. And it just really kind of resonated with me because of what I'm experiencing now. So yeah, that's what I want to talk about is functional disconnection. So just to rewind again, on operations before, I always found I didn't have access to a full range of emotion. And primarily, happiness, sadness were pretty stunted. Happiness, not so much, but sadness and grief were definitely just shut off completely. And a lot of other emotional connections and being able to remain emotionally connected to people other than the people I was operating with, it really shut down for me in a really severe way. And, you can go back and watch the video on emotional numbing, and I talk about that in how it, relates to relationships. So what I've noticed with COVID-19, there's a couple of, I think it's an interesting, it's a window into a lot of these things that happened on operations, but in a different context, basically here at home. So I wanted to share that. So basically since for the last 5-6 weeks. I've been in self-isolation for 4 weeks now, pretty well today. So, I definitely noticed in myself, I noticed that emotional numbing to a point. I noticed that functional disconnection. And I got to be honest, the last 4 weeks have probably been the easiest 4 weeks I've had in Canada in 20 years. I have felt the most calm, relaxed, focused than I have since coming home from Africa in 2001. And, it's definitely, it's that functional disconnection. So definitely emotions are stunted. Definitely sadness and grief are pretty much off the table for the most part, or they're very, very muted. Happiness is, I'm actually doing really well. I'm actually living a very calm, just feeling good, But that emotional connection to other people, that's been kind of stunted as well. So I want to take some time and this, especially for the civilian audience, and talk about what's the same about this and what's the same in as being in operations. And I want to talk about what's different. So basically operations, we'll take Afghanistan, for example. So you go to Afghanistan, we'll say Kandahar Airfield is probably the broadest experience for most people. You live in Kandahar Airfield, and there is this overarching threat, indirect fire, all kinds of other things. There is this overarching threat level all the time. And that's very similar to what we're living in now. There is this threat of coronavirus. And, you know, when you go to get groceries, you could pick it up and whatever. So basically, there is the overarching threat that exists all the time. And as long as you stay within your forward operating base, you stay within your perimeter, you stay inside the wire, as we call it, you're relatively safe. You know, the odds of you being affected by it or being exposed to the threat directly go down. But there's that overarching kind of threat. You know, it's to the same point, you don't leave the perimeter unless there's good reason to. So, you know, if we look at essential travel and essential tasks right now, you know, maybe you don't leave the house except to go for groceries or to go for, you know, important appointments, things like that. And as soon as you leave the house, as soon as you leave the perimeter, that threat level gets elevated. Well, it's the same in Afghanistan. You know, we didn't just leave the wire just for the hell of it. We left the wire for a specific purpose. We had specific goals. We had a plan. We had a plan for if things went wrong. So, you know, I can relate that to living under self-isolation. If I leave the house to go get groceries, I know where I'm going. I know what I'm picking up. I have a plan. I know where I'm going and I know when I'm coming back. So in that regard, it's very similar to living in operations. The other things that are similar are restricted movement. You don't just go wherever you want. Restricted diet. Now, not terribly restricted. I don't know, the grocery stores here are doing decent. You know, but you're restricted in, you know, you're eating at home more than maybe you'd like. Maybe a monotonous diet. Maybe, you know, you're not, if you're like me, you probably know how to cook 4 or 5 staple dishes and that's about it. You know, and all these things, and being disconnected from other people. So those are all things that are very common to the Canadian soldiers' experience in operations. And yeah, and so it's no wonder that for myself and for other veterans that I've spoken to, we kind of went into this headspace of, hey, this is all right. Like, I don't mind this. This is actually not bad at all. So ways that this is different than being overseas, for me anyway. Yeah, I'm experiencing that functional disconnection, but it's not as severe. Like, it was very severe overseas. And I think there's a few reasons for that. I think one is I'm now in a headspace where I'm actively looking at these things and picking them apart because I want things to change for me. So, you know, there's an elevated awareness to all these issues to begin with. And I think that's different. I think it's also different that, you know, when you looked at the threat, you know, in Afghanistan, we'll say, that threat had immediate severe effects. We're talking about, you know, direct and indirect fire. We're talking about improvised explosives. You know, when you encounter that threat, when you meet that threat, the effects are severe, they are immediate, and the consequences are likewise immediate. So if you come into contact with coronavirus, the effects are, you know, it could build over 2 weeks for that incubation period, and it could be very severe or it could be very mild. So I think that's different. The other thing that's different about it is, you know, if we want to compare coronavirus to the Taliban, you know, coronavirus doesn't operate on malicious free will. And what does that mean, malicious free will? Well, that means, you know, the Taliban has this will that they're going to kill you and they're going to change up their tactics. They have the free will to do whatever they want in order to make that happen. And they have a certain number of you know, they got a bag of dirty tricks that they're going to dive into, and they'll change tactics on the turn of a dime. Now, coronavirus in terms of epidemiology and mutation and all that, well, we don't really know a lot about it. Sure, it can change over time, but it doesn't have malicious free will. That threat exists, and there's certain things we can do to avoid it, and we know more about it every day. But you know, it doesn't have that ability to consciously say, "Oh, I'm going to try this." You know, this different vector, this different approach to try and meet the aim of, you know, whatever a virus's aim is, right? Basically to populate. So, you know, it's definitely different. The other thing that I think that's very different is when I experience these things. So, you know, you experience war in a place like Afghanistan, and you're in the same country as the general population. You are experiencing the same events as the general population, but you're experiencing them different. So, the things that affect the general population don't affect you in the same way. Things like supply issues, things like, other government action, other policy, because you stand apart from them. You can go out and you can be involved in the same incident, and you're right there. You're part of the same. You're part of the same incident as the general population, but you leave and go back to your to your base. You're segregated from the population. And there's also the cultural and language boundaries and all those other things that keep you separate and apart. So with coronavirus, I am now experiencing this functional disconnection in Canada and with my fellow Canadians. So I don't have that cultural segregation that I would have had in places like Afghanistan, Bosnia, Africa. So I think all of that has made for a different experience. It's a bit more modulated than what I experienced overseas. And again, change in headspace, it's a different vibe altogether. But yeah, essentially, I'm doing okay. I'm doing well. I feel good. I feel focused. I've been focusing on good self-care routines. I've been focusing on my work. And, I talked about that last week, saying, having a purpose and a passion, that's a big part of maintaining morale. And I've spoken to some veterans who, honestly, the first week or so was euphoric. It really was. It was this, there's this tactical problem, and I've got to come up with new, we call them SOPs, standard operating procedures, and TTPs, tactics, techniques, procedures. This is all new. Like, it's like new operational environment, kind of shiny, new car smell, right? It's exciting for the first little bit, and it was great to have something else to focus energy on. It was great to be in that operational head sphere. And I talked to a lot of veterans who experienced the same thing. And I talked to a lot of them who within the first week, once the, we'll call them tactical problems were solved, how am I going to, feed and clothe everybody? How am I doing all this? Once those problems were solved, they said they experienced, some of them experienced a big crash. And it's like reality just came back in, and things normalized, and they started to experience all the symptoms of PTSD again. And that's another thing too, is that, the symptoms of PTSD are muted. Because I noticed the same thing going overseas. That functional disconnection means all those issues with PTSD just kind of went, all right, yeah, we're on hold, we'll wait. And that's definitely been my experience this time around. And that's part of the euphoria part of it, on that front end. But a lot of guys I talked to said, yeah, it felt great for a few days or a week, and then I crashed. And I haven't experienced a crash. It's definitely been leveling out, so that big spike, and it's just been gradually kind of tapering out as things normalize for me. So I definitely see some of those emotions, some of that, emotional modulation, we'll say, coming back, which is nice. I think the reason I didn't experience a big crash was I have a lot to focus on. I have a lot to put energy into that's very positive for me, that's very, very beneficial for me. And I was doing that before all this exploded. So I think, having that purpose really has helped to keep that crash from coming. And that crash can be huge, because I've experienced that after coming home from operations. And when the emotional numbing or the functional disconnection ends, all those emotions you didn't experience for that entire time come crashing in. And, I haven't experienced that yet. It's been a very nice, even taper off. I'm being very mindful of it. So every time I start to notice a bit of emotional modulation come back, I'm like, okay, taking note of that, addressing that right away. But, it's great to be in a place where, it's funny, when things go to shit, I feel good. I feel better. Internally, in terms of PTSD and all those things. And it's always been that way. So part of me is enjoying the break from those symptoms. It's been 2 years of working very hard, 2+ years of working very hard to just dismantle all of this social programming and to really dig into all the issues that caused, that basically have, caused post-traumatic stress disorder or contributed to it over the years. And I'm going to tell you, it's a lot of work, and it's a constant effort. And it's nice to step back and take a break from that. That being said, the go-getter part of me, the part of me that says, okay, I want this dealt with and I want to move past it, is frustrated because when I'm emotionally disconnected from all those triggers and issues and, emotionally disconnected from the emotional responses that I have to process that I haven't, which is what, contributes to PTSD, it means all progress in that arena has kind of come to a grinding halt for the past 5 weeks. And that's frustrating because, this is my window to really focus on those things and work on those things, and I have been. And yeah, it sucks to have something impede progress in that regard. So I'm really kind of conflicted. Part of me is saying, yeah, you know what, I'm just enjoying the ride at this point and doing everything I can to maintain morale, keep my focus, and enjoy the fact that my mind isn't terribly burdened right now. And the other side of me is saying, yeah, but we want to get at this because, as much as I could sit here and say the past 5 weeks has been pretty good. I've been reasonably happy, reasonably calm, relaxed. I know nothing is cured and resolved. I know it's just all sitting and holding pattern, waiting to come back. So I just wanted to share that as a way to, for any veterans or first responders affected by PTSD who said, yeah, kind of the same. Like I'm kind of chill through this. And who maybe notice that difference, who've experienced those things before. And I wanted to share it because for the civilian population right now who's never lived this way, never lived under the geographic and travel restrictions and, food security issues, or wondering, how am I going to do this? How's this happen? When's this going to change? That changing information too is a huge source of stress. We were just used to it. Yeah, information changes every day, whatever. We just react to it. So this all feels real familiar to us. But for some of you, this is completely new. So it's a good bridging opportunity for us to have this discussion and say, hey, this is kind of how we lived overseas a lot of the times. The only difference is we're not being shot at here. It's a different sort of threat, and we're probably more engaged with you as a general population in sharing that threat than we have been in past experiences. So, I just wanted to take the time to kind of look at all that. I know this has been a long one, but and I hate to bring up coronavirus because we hear enough of it, but honestly, in talking about PTSD and transition, this is the flavor of the day. This is what's going on. And I just wanted to share what's been going on with me in the hopes that maybe some other folks can go, hey, this maybe sheds a bit of light on what I'm feeling and experiencing. If you haven't experienced the crash from it, that's cool. Take some time and look at, okay, why? What am I doing that's keeping me kind of on that peak? And maybe just be aware of, okay, that it doesn't have to be a crash, but that leveling out and that coming down is going to happen. And, I personally don't want it to be a crash. So I want to be very mindful of that as things change. So I'm going to leave you with that this week, guys. I think that's plenty. And I want to thank everybody for their support. It's been difficult. Ride's still going ahead. 15th of May will be the deciding day of whether or not the dispatches ride from the 1st of June to the 1st of September happens, based on travel restrictions and what the entire climate looks like then. So I will keep you posted, and I'll talk to you next week. Cheers.